Ruth, I really appreciate your being here. I'm wondering if you could begin by telling me briefly about your background and how you first became interested in the field of research.
Well, first I have to say I have a very eclectic background. And it was a background that I could never have predicted. It was mostly a background that was related to my husband's many moves and transitions up the academic ladder. And each time we went to a different medical center, I would have to reinvent myself, which I did, and which provided amazing opportunities and challenges and experiences. So I'll start with just the very beginning. I went to Mount Holyoke College and was very interested in psychology, was my major. And I found recently a paper that I had written as part of one of the courses I took on the ethics of the randomized controlled trial. And I thought, that's amazing, because I've been so interested in that all my life, and protecting the rights and promoting the welfare of research participants. So I thought that was very prescient. I went to, after Mount Holyoke, I went to Cornell University, New York Hospital, where I actually got a bachelor's degree in science and a nursing degree at Cornell. And that started my career as a nurse, which I enjoyed very, very much. Eventually, I took a master's degree in advanced nursing as a nurse practitioner. And this was very early in nursing's history, when nurse practitioners were just being established. And I became a nurse practitioner in rheumatology and had a wonderful opportunity to work at the Robert Breck Brigham Hospital as a nurse practitioner. And I was working with an orthopedic surgeon who was extremely wonderful, brilliant, and very supportive of me and this new role. However, the nurse in the clinic was not. And it became very difficult for me to carry out my role when she was instructing me to remember, Mrs. Fischbach, you are a nurse. And don't think you can do any of these other things like examine patients and write prescriptions. Who do you think you are? So I decided I should look around for other opportunities and found a wonderful opportunity at Beth Israel Hospital. They were just beginning a project, and they needed a coordinator for this project. It was a project to see how to increase patients' carrying out of their medical regimen, compliance or adherence, whichever term people like to use. And the idea was that if we could give patients a copy of their medical record, which would record exactly what happened in the examination, they could take that home, and it would help them to remind themselves what happened and what they should be doing. So the nurse who was going to be on this project got cold feet because she didn't feel comfortable sharing the medical record with patients. So it was perfect. I became the nurse, and I was actually a nurse practitioner, so it was perfect. But I was also a participant in the project. So that gave me an unusual view and perspective. We started out as we had planned. We gave patients a copy of the record each time they came in, but we realized that was not adequate. Patients were still very passive. So I thought, okay, we're going to do something novel. We're going to have them co-author the record with us. So we did. So we would start out as saying, okay, Mrs. Brown, why are you here today? And she'd say, I'm here because I have an ache in my ear. And we would talk about it, and we would say, okay, Mrs. Brown, that's right. Patient comes in because of a pain in her ear. And in this one particular case, which was so telling, the patient said, no, it's not pain, it's ache. Mm-hmm. And I said, it was a doctor. We taped all the interviews, so we were able to painfully watch our performance every week. So the doctor said, okay, Mrs. Brown, let's write, patient complains of pain in her left ear. And the patient said, no, it's not pain, it's ache. And the doctor said, well, in medical terms, we always write pain. She said, no, it's not pain, it's ache. And the two of them said that pain is ache. And finally, the doctor said, okay, let's write Mrs. Brown complains of ache in her left ear. And the look of triumph on this patient's face was so remarkable. So that's what we did. We actually wrote every word that the patient said, and the patient wrote it down, and we gave them that copy. And that was the copy that actually went into the medical record. It was very, very unique. And in the end, I published an article about that, and it was one of the most amazing experiences. But that really reinforced my adherence to doing what can be done to help patients and promote their welfare. After that, I decided to apply for an NIH grant, which I did. I wrote a fantastic grant. However, the NIH kept calling to ask for Dr. Fischbach, and I would dutifully refer them to my husband. And then they'd call back and they'd say, well, I guess we must mean you. And I realized to be a researcher, a bona fide professional, I would have to get an advanced degree. I had a master's, but that was not enough. So I enrolled at Boston University. They had a very unique project for PhD candidates, 5 years, and it was in sociology, which I felt was very close to my interests. And I chose as my topic physicians' willingness to share information with patients. And I did a dissertation on that, which was very, very interesting. Found out many, many things. One of which was I asked the physicians, this was a written out interview that they were to fill out and submit to me. And one of the series of questions had to do with the law that was in place in Massachusetts at the time, which allowed patients access to their medical record, but not all medical records, only medical records held by hospitals, not medical records held by private practitioners or medical records held by mental institutions. And I asked the physicians 5 questions, true, false, or don't know. Not one physician out of the 340 that I interviewed answered them all 5 questions correctly. And not one physician answered don't know, which I thought was quite remarkable. They would rather answer wrong, incorrectly, admit that they weren't sure, than answer don't know. I thought that was very telling.
Could you give a sense of what were you testing by asking those 5 true or false questions to those physicians?
They were very simple questions. Does a patient have a right to view the medical record? Does a patient have a right to see medical records held by private practitioners? It was exactly the statutes in the law. There was nothing tricky, very straightforward questions. But it illustrated that they're not quite sure of the law, which is understandable, and I would have been very sympathetic if they had said, don't know. But that didn't help. That didn't work out. From there, we went to St. Louis. I did a postdoc at Washington University in the Department of Psychiatry. This was in 1983, and it was a year in which St. Louis had experienced 4 disasters, 2 which were man-made and 2 which were natural. The Department of Psychiatry had just completed 2 waves of a very important study. It was the Epidemiological Catchment Area study, the ECA study. It was conducted at 5 sites around the nation, and the idea was to compile the prevalence of mental illness in the country. And so 2 waves had already been conducted, And now we had the opportunity to interview the residents again, many of whom had experienced 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these disasters. And it was a remarkable opportunity because we could never be accused of recall bias. This was new information that they were going to be responding to. The disasters were first flooding. St. Louis always floods. The Merrimack River, the Mississippi River always floods in the spring. But what was remarkable this time was that the flooding was in December, and it was freezing cold, and there was actually ice flows that were flowing into people's homes. There were also tornadoes in the spring, which were of unusual severity. Terrible, terrible tornadoes. Those were the natural disasters. The man-made disasters was first the countryside laced with dioxin. Dioxin was used in the Vietnam War as Agent Orange. It caused acute skin eruptions and also cancer. It's a terrible, terrible compound. It's supposedly the most toxic man-made compound. So that's dioxin. Dioxin was a byproduct of some of the products that were made in St. Louis. I don't know if you're probably too young to remember Fischbach, but that was a soap, and particularly for adolescents who had acne, it was a very good soap to put on. There was a company that made Fischbach, and they had wastes which were picked up by waste haulers. And there was a waste hauler by the name of Mr. Raymond Bliss. And he used to go around to the various factories and pick up their waste oil. And what was unusual was that ordinarily he would dispose of the waste oil in some safe place, but this particular time after he went to pick up the Fischbach waste, he decided that he would, since he had some oil in the truck and now this waste, that it would be great to spray the roads of St. Louis. There were many dirt roads, and very often people would like oil placed on the road to keep the dust down. And there were horse rinks where he also could spray the rinks and keep the dust down, which he did. And 2 weeks later, the birds started dropping from the trees, the horses were dying, and people were coming down with an acute case of what looked like severe acne. The EPA was called in, and they got there sometime in early December, tested the soil. They took soil samples, and just after that, after they got the soil samples, the floods came. So the floods actually washed all of the dirt into people's homes and contaminated the countryside. It was only later that this was traced to Mr. Bliss, and his response was, "Ignorance is bliss." But in the meanwhile, he had caused a lot of destruction. And the sad part was that the residents who had to evacuate their homes because of the floods were never allowed to go back to one particular area called Times Beach. They could never go back to reclaim the belongings in their homes. And they were considered themselves pariahs because people felt that they had been contaminated. And so they were dispersed all over the countryside, but some of their children were not allowed into schools. The residents couldn't take laundry to the laundromat to wash. It was a terrible situation, you can imagine. And the second man-made disaster had a very interesting history. During the Second World War, when the project to put together the atomic bomb was in operation, they needed a place, a city, to take the uranium and clean it up and make it weapon-grade uranium. And they decided to take a building over in St. Louis. They painted the windows so that you couldn't look in, and they put a pretty scene on top of the window so that if you were on the outside, it looked like you were looking inside, but in fact you weren't. And they hired people to take this product and purify it. The workers were never told what they were working on. The tailings had to be disposed of somehow, so it was decided that they could be put into big barrels, and the barrels could be dumped into some of the deepest quarries around St. Louis. So that's what they did. And what they hadn't realized was that eventually the barrels would rust and corrode and empty out. And the topography of the St. Louis area is one with a lot of limestone, which has a lot of channels. And it was very easy for the contaminated water now to leach into these channels and eventually end up in people's drinking wells. There were many, many public drinking wells, and these drinking wells became contaminated. So there was a big scare. Newspapers made a big deal of these contaminated wells that people had been drinking now for many, many, many years, and it wasn't clear what was going to happen to the people. So you can imagine, given all of the traumas that these people had endured, that there could be a lot of psychiatric illness that was generated by the 4 different disasters. And we were wondering, do you think it's different if you have a natural disaster versus a man-made disaster? And as it turned out, we seemed to find some small differences. What was most remarkable to us as people were retested was how resilient they were. The floods, they managed, they were aware of them, they were used to them, the tornadoes, despite the intensity and despite the dioxin and then the radioactive well water. But there was some differences in terms of depression and anxiety that we were noting. It seemed like natural disasters created more anxiety, whereas man-made disasters created more depression. Not clear why, but that was a finding. So that was a very interesting experience. But while I was working in the Department of Psychiatry, my interests more and more were turning to bioethics and ethics, and I began sitting in on a class that was taught by the only doctor who was really interested in bioethics and ethics. And I sat in his classes, and afterwards I would speak with him and discuss the issues, and pretty soon I was sitting in class with him, and pretty soon I was helping him teach, and then he died. And there I was. I was the only one who was qualified to take over his courses. So I did, and I was appointed a chairman of this, and I became the main person in charge of bioethics at Washington University. I started a program in the humanities and medicine, which is happy to say still extant, I believe. From there, I went to Harvard. I was there for 8 years. Then we went to the NIH. I was there for 3 years. And now back in New York City at Columbia University, where I started the Center for Bioethics, and that's been going strong for 10 years. We've just celebrated our 10th anniversary, which is at Columbia is quite unique, and I'm proud of that. My current interest, again, because of interests of my husband, is in autism research, and doing a very interesting study of parents who have a child on the autism spectrum and scientists who are funded by the Simons Foundation who are doing genetic research. Several years ago, when the project was just started, it was assumed that autism, which we know is one of the most heritable disorders, was caused by a gene. Well, we're finding that's not true, that it's a very complex disorder, maybe many disorders, and there is not one gene that is going to be responsible. But nonetheless, there's still a great deal of interest in trying to locate whatever complex of genes that might be responsible. But I've been talking with people about stigma that's associated with autism. I think in the past, maybe 5 years, stigma, I think, has been dissipating, primarily because of all of the attention that the media has placed on stigma. There are so many books and movies and magazine articles and marches and the whole issue with Asperger's. I mean, the population feeling very elite and feeling that they are closely identified with Mozart and with Einstein, and they're very special. Unfortunately, now the new DSM-5, the latest edition of the Diagnostic and Schedule Manual, Statistical Manual of the Psychiatric Association, is going to combine Asperger's into their autism spectrum disorder. There's going to be no longer an Asperger designation. And it's very interesting to see what will happen at this point, because the people in the Asperger community, the Aspies, as they like to call themselves, are not happy. They're not, and I'm wondering if they're not happy because they don't want to be associated with people who don't have as high functions as they do. And is there some stigma attached now to being associated with this group? It's not my hypothesis, but the leaders in the field have done a lot of testing, a lot of surveys, a lot of investigation. And they feel, and rightly so, I do agree, there is no line that you can draw and say, okay, this is autism and this is Asperger's. There is no line, it's a continuum, and that's why they call it a spectrum. And so Asperger's will just now be included in the umbrella, and it will be an autism spectrum disorder. And we don't know what the implications of that will be. People worry that maybe because they're higher functioning, they won't even qualify for an autism diagnosis. And if that happens, they won't be able to be eligible for services. And services are very, very important for this community. And the Asperger community has a need for services. It's not as though they're perfectly fine. They really do need services. So the worry will have to be resolved. We just don't know at this point what will happen. We've already interviewed over 450 parents, and we're asking questions about how they interpret this shift and what their concerns will be. So,
do you have any preliminary results?
No, I won't know until we reach our goal of 500 parents, which I hope we will do in the spring. And then we have to analyze the data. And we've also asked the scientists similar questions. So we want to really see if there's concordance between what the scientists believe and what the parents believe. If there are any differences. And the interview that we've developed is very comprehensive, and we ask many, many questions. Many questions about stigma, and what strategies parents use to mitigate stigma. And we're going to be preparing a lexicon of hurtful words, and then whatever mitigating methods people use to help relieve some of the stigma that they may experience. We will put together a webinar, which we hope will be, I'm going to use Primer as a model of a webinar, and it's going to be primarily for healthcare providers, and see what kinds of strategies we can offer them to help youngsters and parents who are dealing with autism and its aftermath. So I'm looking forward to seeing the data, because right now I'm just not sure, given the shift. We're also asking questions about the media and their perceptions of the media, whether the media portrays autism correctly and adequately, because most of the media presentations that I've seen, for example, Parenthood, which I think is a wonderful show of a young boy on the autism spectrum who's obviously an Asperger type of personality. We don't see the children and adults who are severely affected, people in diapers when they're teenagers, and people who are nonverbal, and people who are banging their head on the wall. We don't see those people. We only see the people like Max in Parenthood, who are, very, makes you feel sympathetic, but also admiring. And so I don't think the media portrays autism adequately. So, but we'll see. But I do think that given all of the media attention, there has been a real shift in people's perceptions about autism. It's not seen as such a terrible tragedy, even though, as I mentioned, we don't see the unfortunate people who are so severely affected.
Right, they're not portrayed.
My next project, I hope to be funded, will be to find out about older women between the ages of 22 and 45. We know nothing about this population, and I mean nothing.
That population of women who have Asperger's or
who have autism, who are on the spectrum. Obviously, we've had autism for years and years. It's just become recently so prevalent and so obvious. But for many years, people were kept in the closet. I mean, they were in the attic. They were not seen. And we know that there are many women who are on the spectrum who have never been diagnosed, because the diagnosis, first of all, for Asperger's wasn't established till 1994. So if you were born before then and grew up before then, you would not have received a diagnosis. So we don't know the quality of these women's lives. Most of the information that's available about autism and about older people in that age group are primarily about men.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I know why. Because, first of all of the instruments are normed on men, and men are 4 times as likely as women to be diagnosed. So there are more men around. And women, their manifestations are more acceptable. They don't stand out. For example, if you have a child, a girl, who is fixated and really rigidly involved with Barbie dolls, that's not unusual. But if you have a boy who is fixated on the wheels of a car and just over and over again playing with the wheels of a car, you would pick that child out. If you saw a girl who was very shy, that's okay. That's acceptable for a girl, but for a boy, it wouldn't be. So the boys are identified. Girls have a way of compensating. They want to be socially acceptable, and they know how to be in a group, but not stand out, just be quiet. But they're still part of the group, as opposed to boys who are obvious. It's more obvious that they're different. They have different personalities, and so I think the prevalence of males versus females may be even higher when you get to an older age group. So we'll see.
Right.
So that's my current research. Stem cell research is really a fascinating area, and I know that there are so many mixed feelings and very passionate feelings on all sides. In fact, I have a poster here at Primer on a distance learning course that we developed on stem cell research. And there's a cute little cartoon about there are two petri dishes and their embryos in the dishes, and one dish is saying something about, well, I guess embryonic research is the way to go, and the other creature in the petri dish is saying, no, life begins at conception. And the researcher is standing over them saying, even the petri dishes can't agree.
Right.
And so one of the Primer members came by the poster, and I asked him, are you interested in stem cell research? He said, yes. I said, good. I said, how do you feel about it? He said, I'm very passionate about it. I said, really? And he said, yes. And he said, what's your poster about? And I could see he was a little hostile already. And I said, well, we're trying to be very neutral. We don't take a side. He said, what do you mean you don't take a side? You should take a side. And I said, really? He said, yes. He said, let's not have it. And so I thought, okay. And I too have had some interesting experiences and very poignant experiences. My son and daughter-in-law are both carriers of the cystic fibrosis gene. And through a long history, which I won't go into, they ended up having in vitro fertilization with pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So you know about the process. And they had 2 embryos implanted, which were free of the gene. And I was there. I wasn't there at the actual implanting, but immediately afterwards. And they showed me pictures of the 2 embryos that were implanted. 2 globs of, looked like almost transparent nothingness, little globs. But I looked at their faces of my son and daughter-in-law, and they were not globs. They were the future. And it was amazing. I mean, I could get very tearful about how that worked out for them. It changed my perception about embryonic research. I mean, we are not dealing with globs. We are dealing with potential life. And I'm not saying that, we're dealing with little people in the petri dish, but certainly the opportunity of life to go on if implanted and if a pregnancy should result. So I'm very respectful of these little globs, and I do think that they represent a future. So I don't take embryonic research lightly. On the other hand, I weigh that against the potential of what these little globs might do in terms of new therapies and new drugs and new ways of helping many, many people. So when I balance that, I come out on the side of embryonic stem cell research. We keep giving the number of 400,000. It's probably 500,000, but we'll say 400,000 embryos that are stored in fertility clinics. And there are 4 things that could happen to those embryos that are stored. They could be stored in perpetuity. Of course, people have to pay for the storage each year. They could be donated to other couples. Interestingly enough, the creators of these embryos are not keen on doing that. They're not enthusiastic about giving up their embryos. It's like giving up their children. So they don't particularly want to do that. The embryos could be disposed of, washed down the drain, or they could be given up for research. And for many couples who feel that they don't have a need any longer for these embryos, many of them feel that would be a worthwhile gift that they could donate. So those those embryos that really don't have a future because they'll either be stored in a freezer, they won't be given up for adoption, they might be flushed down the drain, but they might have a future in some form of research. So I am in favor of that, but I am at the same time very respectful and very grateful for the gift that these couples give to make sure that research can go forward and that we may find somehow a way to create islet cells so that we could cure people who have diabetes, or some sort of nerve cell that could be useful in spinal cord injury. Cardiac, we're already thinking about cardiac muscle involvement, and so there are opportunities that we have. Many people are working on them.
Do you find there is a starting place that you can have a conversation with people who have that strong reaction of disagreement about the use of embryonic stem cell research?
I wish there was. I honestly wish there was. But in fact, there is no common ground.
None at all.
People who believe that life begins at conception, that's their belief. And you can't change it. And you could say, well, there's no scientific evidence, or, people believe maybe when different cultures have different beliefs. Jews believe that life begins on the 40th day, and there are many, many different cultures that have different beliefs. And so we just can't say that just because your religion believes in X, that's what X is. And scientists have not been able to come up with a definite definition either. So we're caught in a kind of a netherland, and I just feel that until somehow we can arrive at some great discovery with stem cell research and a cure that people believe in, that we will be able to then change the people's minds. It's like IVF. In the early years of IVF, when people felt we can't play God, we can't create people in a petri dish. Well, we did. And many of these people who are very, the religious right, who are very against stem cell research, are also perhaps beneficiaries of IVF, and maybe have children that were created by IVF. So it's a very it's a challenge. But right now, for those people who really believe that it's the time of conception, and even before now, before conception, there's a chance that people believe when the sperm first hits the egg, no matter where it is, it's going to be life.
Right. So can you forecast at all? Do you have any idea of where you think this debate will go in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? What do you think there's some inevitable path that we're going down?
Well, I think for one thing, it's very politically oriented, and so depending on the president who's in office, I think we will see research either moving rapidly forward or at a much, much slower pace. So when Bush, in August of 2001, announced that, in a very, I consider one of the most brilliant speeches, he said he favored stem cell research, and yet he put on a restriction that there could be no more new stem cell lines created after August 9th, 2001, and that we would be doomed to use only at the time they thought there were 60 stem cell lines that were viable, but in fact it turned out to be 20 some odd. And even so, to this day, we cannot use federal funds to create new stem cell lines. Except now, I should say, I have to modify that. The Dickey-Wicker Amendment has limited funding to create stem cell lines with federal funds. But we can now, thanks to President Obama create stem cell lines using private funds, which is what is being done, provided that the researchers follow very, very strict procedures and informed consent procedures. So new lines are being created, and research is moving ahead rapidly because of George W. Bush's restrictions. We had actually a flurry of great research and many, many advances with iPS cells and SCNTs who were able to use new technologies to create stem cells and that don't have the same difficulty with conceived embryos. And I have to say there is a lot of excellent research using adult stem cells, and that should continue. And I think one of the difficulties is for researchers to be able to demonstrate that stem cell research, these stem cells created through embryos, are actually better than adult stem cells. But because we haven't been able to come across any great discoveries, we can't say that yet. But researchers do feel that there are many advantages to using embryonic stem cells as opposed to adult stem cells. But both forms of research need to go forward very, very quickly and be promoted as much as possible. We're always worried about informed consent, and is it truly informed for anything, any experiment, any type of therapy. But the hope is that people do understand that the informed consent must be provided after the embryos have been created, usually a year after, so that people have had a chance to consider the implications. What's even more, for me, troubling is to ask people people like you who might want to donate embryos for research that has nothing to do with reproduction. And so we're actually paying young women to give eggs, to donate eggs. And in order to donate eggs, they have to go through an IVF procedure, which has many risks and discomforts and is not a pleasant process.
And some risks we don't even know, or some risks we haven't been able to determine.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so that's a problem. On the other hand, they happen to be the embryos that are created, fresh eggs, are conceivably the best. And so it's an interesting dilemma. In the state of Massachusetts, they decided that they would ask women to donate eggs, but they did not want to use any form of coercion, so there was no monetary compensation. No one donated. Okay, so that was clear. So New York decided that they would provide the same compensation to women donating eggs for research as women donating eggs for fertility processes. So they give $8,000 to a woman who decides to donate eggs. And you could say, well, that's coercive. And maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. I mean, it's...
Well, that brings up the question of, if someone is undergoing an elective procedure which involves some risk, and could they undergo the same procedure for research purposes, and ought it to be held to a different standard if it's for research as opposed to for the purpose of helping somebody else have a child? I'm not sure.
Well, they have to have the same procedures. They can't cut corners for one or the other. They're both the same procedures. It's just that once the eggs are retrieved from the woman, they either undergo fertility, they are placed with sperm and create an embryo, or that then is implanted or stored for a couple, or else they may be frozen and given to researchers.
but even though the procedure is the same, and therefore presumably the risks are the same, and the compensation is the same, but it's not considered coercive to pay a woman $8,000 to have her ovaries stimulated to donate eggs for somebody else's childbearing.
Yeah. Well, it's a dilemma. It's an interesting conundrum, and I don't think we really have a good answer yet, but those are good questions to consider. I just wanted to mention Rebecca Skloot's book about the immortal life of Henrietta Lacks, because reading that and listening to it, we listened to it on disc, and I read it again, and then hearing Rebecca Skloot's presentation at Primer, and meeting her and wanting to actually invite her to be a speaker at the MBL that I'm involved with. I really think that she has done a great deal to, it's still on the bestseller list, by the way, to promote interest in research and to really point out how we have abused research participants. And it really makes me more dedicated than ever to my career of protecting the welfare of research participants and promoting their health and whatever their rights. So I think I'm glad that Primer has gone so far as to invite Rebecca Skloot. I know people really enjoyed her presentation, and her book is very, very important, not just for Henrietta Lacks and how she was exploited, but her cells were exploited, but there's much in the book that has to do with research ethics and other examples where research subjects have been abused, and I think it's a very good lesson for people to read that book, to understand how important research is, but how easy it is to take advantage of the vulnerable among us. And at some point we may all be vulnerable, so it's a very good lesson.